Uber is coming for Turo. But what does this mean for Turo hosts? Last week, Uber announced that they would be expanding their car-sharing platform that had previously only been available in Australia. And ever since the news has been released, headline after headline is stating that Uber is now directly competing with Turo. But let's dive into what is actually going on in the car-sharing community, because some of these articles aren't entirely accurate, or at least they're not painting the full picture. Now, before we dive in, despite what my hat may tell you, this video was not in fact recorded in the winter. It is recorded in June. Some days you just have to commit to wearing a beanie even if it's 95 degrees outside. So let's get started right from the top. 2 years ago in 2021, Uber acquired the Australian car-sharing platform Car Next Door. And Car Next Door is very similar to Turo. This idea that you rent out your car to your peers in exchange for money, that there are a lot of cars out there that are simply unused, and so in order to limit waste, help the environment, and make some extra cash, you can rent out your cars to your peers whenever you're not using it. Like I mentioned a moment ago, this platform was only available in Australia and has been operating in Australia even under the Uber umbrella over the years. In 2021, Uber acquired Car Next Door, and shortly after that, Uber changed the name to Uber Carshare. Uber has been operating Uber Carshare ever since they acquired it, and just this week, they announced that they would be expanding Uber Carshare to North American markets. In the United States, they would be starting out by operating Uber Carshare in Boston, which, fun fact, is actually where Turo was founded. Originally, Turo was founded as Relay Rides. They ended up changing to Turo, but when it was founded in Boston. And in addition to Boston, Uber will also be expanding Uber Carshare to Toronto. With Uber Carshare, people will be able to rent your car out for an hourly or daily rate, and they can also use the cars they rent for Uber or just for personal use. And of course, you, the owner, get paid for renting out your cars to these people. Now, as of right now, there's a lot that we don't know about Uber Carshare. We don't know the vehicle eligibility, deductibles, protection packages situation. There is just simply a lot of questions that we don't have the answers to. And because of the fact that Uber has not released an Uber Carshare terms of service for United States customers, we probably won't get the answers to these questions until the terms of service is released. Because as we know with Turo, terms of service can vary quite a bit from country to country. For example, with Turo, you have different types of vehicle eligibility if you're somebody that lives in the United States versus if you're somebody that lives in Europe, or the number of other countries that Turo operates in. So I do expect that the terms of service with Uber Carshare will also vary from country to country as well. So while the way that Uber Carshare operates in Australia will give us some valuable insight into what we may be able to expect whenever they come to the United States, it certainly doesn't give us the full picture either. But truthfully, after digging into Uber Carshare and how the business model has been operating in Australia thus far, I actually don't think that Uber Carshare is coming for Turo. I think they're coming for Getaround. Now, Turo is the biggest player in the car sharing space, so of course, if there is another big player entering this industry, it is of course going to affect Turo in some way, shape, or form. But there are some big differences between the Turo business model and the Uber car share business model, at least how it's currently being operated in Australia, and I expect that some of these practices will end up transitioning over to the North American markets as well. And these differences make a difference whenever we talk about Turo compared to Uber car share. First is hourly rates. Turo does not do hourly rates on any of their rentals. Even if you're somebody that books a car for, say, 1 day and you want to extend that car by 1 or 2 hours, you don't have the option to do that on an hourly basis. If you want to extend a car past that 24-hour mark to that 25 or 26-hour mark, you have to book the car for an entirely new day. Now, you don't necessarily have to keep the car for that entire day, but you do have to pay for that entire day. Getaround, on the other hand, does allow hourly bookings. In fact, whenever I was a Getaround host previously, it was pretty common for people to rent their cars for only a couple of hours at a time. In fact, the shortest renter we ever had with one of our cars was about 45 minutes. And while this does occasionally happen with Turo as well, where we'll have a guest who books our car for just a few hours, typically to either pick somebody up from the airport, to move something, whatever the case is, it is significantly less common on Turo than it was on Getaround. So Getaround does offer hourly rates, and so does Uber Carshare. Next is driving for ride-sharing platforms, and this is the biggest difference. Turo does not allow for their guests to use Turo vehicles to ride for rideshare services, whether that's Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, whatever the case is. Now, this does still occasionally happen on Turo, but it's something that is prohibited per the terms of service. And if you have a guest that rents your car and they tell you that they're going to be using that car for Uber Eats, Lyft, or DoorDash, then you actually have to tell them that they cannot rent the car. You have to report that to Turo, and then they will end up canceling the reservation on the guest's behalf because of the fact that that is a prohibited activity. Getaround, on the other hand, does allow this. In fact, they embrace it. Getaround's been rolling out a program called Drive with Uber, which basically allows for you to opt your car in to the Uber program, in which case a guest could rent your car and then use it for Uber or Uber Eats. This was something that we did allow with our Get Around cars whenever we were on the Get Around platform, and I would say about 90% of all of our guests used our cars for that purpose, so it was very, very popular. This is something that Uber will of course allow as well. But I am really curious to see what the fate of the Drive with Uber program is now that Uber is entering the car sharing game. Are they still going to allow for Get Around drivers to rent cars that they can then use on Uber, or are they going to take Get Around out of the equation altogether? It'll be interesting to see how that ends up shaking out. I have no idea what's going to happen. And last but certainly not least is the type of cars in which these different platforms allow. Now, Turo advertises themselves as an adventure platform, a place where you can go to rent a car that you can't find on these other rental platforms. This is one of the reasons why Turo's catchphrase is "Own the Adventure." You can rent a car that you simply can't rent elsewhere. And that sounds really cool in theory, but whenever you begin to dig into the Turo business model, you'll find that Turo actually has a wide variety of different cars available to rent. You of course do have these adventure-focused, experience-focused cars. You have luxury and high-end cars. You have normal everyday family cars, or you have people like me who are renting out low-end economy cars. But the fact is, with Turo, you have to rent a car that is 12 years old or newer with 130,000 miles or less, and there are some exceptions that are made for some classic vehicles. But you could theoretically rent out an exotic car, a sports car, a wide variety of different cars. Get Around, on the other hand, focuses on that A to B driver. They allow older cars in the platform, they don't allow two-door or two-seater vehicles, and they are really putting a focus on those cars that a person is going to be using in order to get from point A to point B, commute to and from work, pick up their kids from school, those types of things. Normal, everyday activities. There is a lot of overlap in the cars that Get Around allows to be rented on their platform and the cars that Uber allows for you to use as an Uber driver. And I assume that whenever it comes to the eligibility of cars for Uber car share, it'll be very similar. They'll probably allow the same types of cars that they allow to be listed on the Uber platform, because it would seem counterproductive for them to do anything different. But again, we don't know this for sure, and we'll have to wait until the terms of service is released in order to find out. But I do think it's safe to assume that Get Around and Uber car share are going to be offering a very similar selection of vehicles, while Turo is going to remain focused on that more adventure-style renter. Even the operations of Uber car share is very similar to Get Around. With Uber car share, you can opt into the Instant Key program, which allows you to do key exchanges with a remote key smart lockbox. Get Around does something very similar with their Get Around Connect device. This includes built-in GPS, automated tolls, and it costs $19.99 per month. This is again very, very similar to what Get Around offers with their Get Around Connect device, even down to the fee structure, which is the exact same. The point is that whenever you dig into the business model of Uber car share and Turo, the business models are a bit different. And whenever we begin to look at car sharing platforms and the cars that are best suited for these platforms, while the car sharing business model may in theory sound very, very similar, the types of cars that work on these platforms are oftentimes different. For example, whenever it comes to Get Around, there are cars that I have in my Turo fleet that perform extremely well that I would never buy for Get Around because these cars just wouldn't perform the same way, or they're just explicitly not allowed. The same will most likely be able to be said about Uber car share, at least to some degree. While the business models are very similar in theory, the execution is different, and thus the types of cars and the types of renters that thrive on these platforms are also going to be different. The point is that while Uber car share is of course going to be competing with every platform and service that offers rental cars, whenever we really dig into the business model of Uber car share, its direct competitor isn't necessarily Turo, it is absolutely Get Around. And truthfully, if I was Get Around, I'd probably be a bit worried. And this comes at a particularly interesting time for Get Around. Get Around stock is basically a penny stock now after it's torpedoed since its IPO. And it's also coming at a time where Get Around has implemented a security deposit which has caused demand to plummet in certain markets, my market included. Get Around also just purchased HireCar, a move that does expand their market share in the gig economy, but also one that probably doesn't help Get Around's reputation. So it'll definitely be interesting to see how this shakes out and how this ends up affecting not only Turo, but also Get Around. And if I was a betting person, I would bet that it's going to have a much larger effect on Get Around than it does Turo, simply because of the different business models. But of course, we also have to ask the question of how does this affect hosts? And to be honest, I think that this is a good thing. Like I mentioned throughout this video, I don't think the renters and the cars for Uber car share versus Turo are going to 100% overlap. I think that to a degree they're going to be different. And so for Uber car share to enter the game, I think it gives hosts a great opportunity to diversify. At this point, Turo is the biggest player in this space, and competition is always good. And giving hosts different options to explore is, in my opinion, always a good thing. Especially given the fact that Uber is such a large company, they're not a new startup. I think that that's a good thing all the way around. Now, one thing I do think is important to mention, and it's something that I've talked about in videos in the past, is that Turo does have an exclusivity clause. This means that if you have your car listed on Turo, you cannot rent that exact same car out on GetAround, HireCar, or Uber CarShare. This is explicitly against the terms of service, and if you do end up doing this and your car is in an accident on Turo and Turo finds out that you had your car on different platforms, they're going to void your damage claim and they're not going to pay you out. This is important to mention because though Uber CarShare is a great way to diversify your fleet, you cannot list the same cars on Uber CarShare that you have on Turo. This is why whenever I joined GetAround, I had exclusive cars on GetAround, exclusive cars on Turo, and they did not overlap at all. And it wasn't until I unlisted my cars on GetAround that I then put them on Turo. They were not on these platforms at the same time. So if you are somebody who wants to expand with Turo and you want to experiment with Uber CarShare, then you will have to buy a separate car for the Uber CarShare platform. But overall, I think this is really interesting. I think that this is a good move for Uber, but we'll ultimately have to see how they navigate things like damage claims, stolen cars, missing vehicles, late returns. It has been proven over the years by Turo that dealing with these different issues is a very, very costly endeavor. And very few companies have been able to do it successfully. And over the years, we've seen a number of large companies announce plans to release their own car sharing services, with those plans to quietly fizzle because these companies end up realizing that it just doesn't work. Few companies have been able to implement car sharing platforms successfully, Turo of course being the biggest. And truthfully, I think if there is another company that can do this successfully, Uber would probably be one of them. But I think it'll be really interesting to see how it shakes out over the next couple of years. I am going to be keeping a close eye on the Boston and Toronto market as the platforms roll out there, and once it does end up coming to the Dallas market, I will absolutely be giving it a try just to see how it works. But all in all, I don't think that this is bad news. Diversification is always good, and people entering the game keeps Turo competitive. We don't want Turo to be the only car sharing platform out there that's dominating the car sharing space, so having other people entering and leaving is always something that is a benefit. I'm looking forward to seeing how this shakes out over the next few months and over the next few years, and of course, I'll keep you guys posted as we learn more, and hopefully once that terms of service is released for the American market. But like always, you guys, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, comments, if you have anything to add, I would love to hear it. So make sure to leave a comment down below. And while you guys are at it, make sure to hit the like button, hit that subscribe button, and hit the notification bell. And I will see you guys in the next video.